Thanks very much for being here today, and good afternoon. My name's Edwina Throsby and I'm the Head of Talks and Ideas at the Sydney Opera House, and I want to thank you all for bearing with us through some pretty stressful days. Thanks for coming along and understanding. Now, as I imagine you all already know, despite a lot of people's best efforts to try and make it happen, Chelsea Manning was not granted her visa to be able to attend today in time. She was... We received a notification of an intention to consider denial under Section 51B of the Immigration Act, and this is an act which a section that pertains to the notion of character, not being of good character. And it strikes me that the notion of character is nothing if not subjective. Depending on where you sit, someone is either a martyr or a terrorist, an expert or a propagandist, a traitor or a whistleblower. These distinctions can be pointed or blurry, again, depending on your politics and your perspective. And look, I understand why character has to be part of the Immigration Act. We don't want people coming to this country inciting hate or violence. We don't want people who are likely to hurt, murder, attack any Australian citizens. I think everybody agrees with that. But Chelsea Manning leaked thousands of classified documents to Wikileaks. She's served many years in jail for that, and a few in solitary for this act. And there is vigorous and I think important debate about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to do, whether she was laying bare war crimes and corruption and exposing a system which didn't always support values that we might hold dear, or whether she was committing an act of treason which jeopardised sensitive operations and military events. And people are entitled to their opinions about this. But Chelsea Manning was not coming to Australia to incite hate or violence. She was not coming to maim anyone, to kill anyone, and it's hard to think that her coming to this country to talk about data privacy, surveillance, or, ironically, the abuse of power, is going to be a threat to our national security in this country. So I'm glad that we've been able to make it happen, albeit by long distance, because I do think that what Chelsea has to say is important, and I think it deserves to be heard and discussed and debated by Australians. She's going to be speaking today with Peter Greste, who is an academic at the University of Queensland and, of course, a well-known journalist. While he was working with Al Jazeera in 2014, he was arrested by the Egyptian government and spent more than a year in jail in Egypt. I think that he is a really good person to be talking to Chelsea today. So I'd like you to welcome to the stage convicted terrorist and one of the nicest and most gentle men I know, Peter Greste.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chelsea Manning. We haven't got all night. A convicted terrorist talking to a convicted spy. No wonder the authorities are worried. Chelsea, you've probably heard there's an issue over character. Are you of bad character?
I mean, that's a matter of interpretation.
Just to be clear, the question under the Act, the question of character, or someone is deemed to be of bad character if you've been convicted of a crime and spent more than convicted and sentenced to more than 12 months. And of course, the minister does have the discretion to override this, to allow people into the country regardless of that background. And I think everyone here would recognise that there is something fundamentally flawed in the fact that you haven't been allowed to come. So I endorse Edwina's comments a few moments ago. Edwina, Chelsea, I just wanted to begin by asking you, by taking you back, because this is, I think, quite fundamental to where we are at the moment. And that's what it was in Bradley Manning's mind that made him feel that it was time to leak, but took him from being an intelligence analyst in the military, a soldier, into something.
I'm sorry. Please don't dead name me.
No. That's fine. I guess what I was trying to say is the kind of transformation that you went through, in both politically and personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's life is a journey, and certainly been a part of that. You know, like from childhood to growing up and going through many different transitional periods, living in the UK for a while, and being homeless, being in the military. I think all of these things, certainly add together in a cumulative effect for, making the experience that is my life.
But in terms of what was going on in the field, and when we spoke earlier, you were talking about how you saw a feedback loop that was ultimately destructive. I'm just wondering if you can talk us through the process that you went through as a military analyst, because obviously someone doesn't sign up you don't join the military, or very few people join the military intending to turn against it. What was it that flipped the switch in your mind?
Well, it's a loaded question. So I think that, I enlisted in the military when I was, 19. So obviously very young and idealistic. I wanted to make a difference in the world. Also, I had just been homeless for about 6 months. So it was a sense of security, especially at a time whenever I'm, working odd jobs at my aunt's house, and being kind of genderqueer, not really knowing what's going on with my gender identity, and also, working 80 hours a week with, juggling 2 jobs and also going to college at the same time. And I got burnt out by all of these different things, and I wanted to make a difference in my life. And every day on national television was the surge, the so-called surge in Iraq. And it just dominated. It dominated the conversation. It dominated the dinner table. It dominated. It was just an all-encompassing experience at the time. And I wanted to do something and be a part of something. And my father, I also wanted to I naively thought the military will man me up, so to speak. I brought, my skills in terms of math and analysis. Ironically, I didn't really want to work with computers, which is why I became an intelligence analyst. But that changed, as I arrived, they're like, okay, here's a brand new computer system that, y'all are going to be using now. So I just used the computers to do statistics and modeling, Bayesian statistics in particular. But, at the time, it was just number crunching that I ended up doing. And I had a very mathematical mindset on this. I viewed, I thought of Iraq and Afghanistan as being equations that can be solved, that, somehow I could just math the shit out of this and, make a difference. And by the time I arrived in Iraq in 2009, the war had been going on for so long that, there was huge amounts of data for us to pore over and to run models on. And I focused on that. But once you're immersed in a war zone, you realize just how, like, it wasn't statistics anymore. Like, it was, like, these were people with lives and, flaws and, all of the vulnerabilities that people have and all of the hopes and dreams and, like, mistakes that are made and the life and death. And it just became so real and so raw, just being there and flying over, flying over neighborhoods and, knowing the names of the neighborhoods and like which Mulholland number it was, whether it was Zafrania or,
So these were,
it's a lot.
So these were neighborhoods that you'd been studying as an analyst back in the US, and started to know and understand and got to know quite intimately, as pieces of geography rather than as pieces of human geography.
Right, and that changes your perspective of things, like, because I knew everything about this area, but I didn't know anything at all until, like, I saw it. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I've worked in Iraq, I've worked in Baghdad, I've worked in Afghanistan, and there's that gap between what you see on the ground, the kind of messy, violent, complex, messed up kind of place that you see on the ground, and the very sanitized version that people see back in their homes on their television screens. Is that how it occurred to you?
It's not so simple as that. I mean, there's also there's bad stuff, but, also, like, people live lives. There were kids who would, be playing soccer or, football. And, there would be, like, people trying to reach out and help each other, on both, like, whether local or, whether it was us as being an occupying force. And it's like I really can't, talk about details all that much, but I mean, if you look at the video, the assault or the Apache weapons team video from 2007 that's out there now, it's all, like, it's so much deeper and more complicated. You see the worst of humanity, but in other moments you see, like, some of the best of humanity. Like, like, if you watch the whole thing, you see, like, people trying to help people, and it's just so complicated. And I don't think that there's I'm not one to break it down so simply.
No, just for those members of our audience who weren't aware of the video, this was an absolutely shocking video that was filmed from the Apache helicopters, a couple of helicopters that were asking for permission to open fire on a gathering, on a meeting in the city. And that meeting also happened to include a couple of Reuters journalists. And we know that
and nobody would care if it wasn't for that, because there was just, it was just business as usual. It was just another day. There just happened to be more information about this because it was journalists, and unfortunately, journalists' lives have a tendency of being valued more by the outside world than everyone else.
But in this case, what it also did was draw, well, I guess it must have inspired you, must have made you feel that there was something that needed to be exposed, and it certainly drew a lot of attention from the public. That was a big sigh.
Yeah, it's just, it seems so self-evident to me.
So, Len, again, let me take you forward. I don't want to dwell too much on this, and I know you want to move forward to the present, but what I do want to do is ask you about the kind of psychology that was taking place that you saw, the kind of, you mentioned Bayesian statistics and the way that the computer modeling was influencing the way that the military was operating. Could you just talk us through that very briefly and explain how it was that you came to feel that something had to give?
Well, I think it's interesting that we were doing computer modeling. We were spending an awful lot of time doing this stuff, and I did this work. 12 hours a day, every single day, without a weekend. Unfortunately, it wasn't really like it was only. The modeling was only useful whenever it fit within what the command wanted. So if it didn't fit in that, we were just sidelined, our work was sidelined. So, the sense of having an actual contribution was nothing more than, a political one.
So, but when we spoke, you were talking very much about the kind of feedback loops that were taking place where and the kind of the decision making. Is that something that we can talk through?
I mean, which part of I can explain the decision making process for that kind of thing. It's activity happens in a particular neighborhood, and this is the same thing with policing. Here in the U.S., activity happens. So a lot of activity happens that gets reported. So reports are made, which leads to more U.S. or police, police presence in American policing systems. And I'm using policing systems as an example because many of the military things are classified, but they're very analogous to predictive policing methods. And what happens is you end up reporting more in neighborhoods in which you have more people, and therefore it starts to you start to develop hotspots in which there's a lot of activity because we keep sending people there, and it's very much a feedback loop that happens where we intensify our activities in a location. And the responses intensify, and the reporting, becomes more frequent. So it seems like the hotspot just gets hotter and hotter, and and you can see this, and you can model this, and you can play with the numbers to see this. But when you start to do that, again, the computer models are only helpful for decision makers when it fits within the decision that they want to make.
We'll come to that a little bit more in a minute, but one of the things that you've said since coming out of prison is that the life that you see here reflects in a lot of ways the kind of life that you saw in prison. You mentioned what you've said is a world with surveillance and so on. Can you explain that?
Right. It's quite clear. Here in the United States in particular, we live in a domestic military occupation. Many of our most vulnerable communities have, police with body armor and AR-15s, policing neighborhoods, usually people of color or immigrants. And, you see, you see surveillance cameras everywhere, both private and public. And you see, the intense, and what's happened is a mentality of, we're going into a neighborhood and we're not policing it. We're patrolling it, has sort of infected, law enforcement. And then the relationship between law enforcement and the intelligence community and the military in recent years, with fusion centers, has blurred the lines to where the police is now a military and the military is very much a police force. And those lines just keep getting blurrier and blurrier. And if you go into any neighborhood in a major city, Oakland, I've seen this in Oakland, I've seen this in Brooklyn, I've seen this in Baltimore, I've seen this in parts of Northeast DC. You really start to see what's going on. And, you'll see police cars that have their lights flashing for presence. they just roll around neighborhoods with their lights flashing.
But Chelsea,
for,
but there are
constantly.
plenty of people who would say that we're living in a dangerous environment. The war on terror is going on. Terrorists themselves are becoming more sophisticated. Organised crime is becoming more sophisticated. Shouldn't the police be allowed to be able to use all of the pieces of technology that they have to keep us safe?
No, because it only gets used it keeps getting used for bad purposes, and it slides in this direction. So that makes me think that you can't trust government to be benevolent all the time. I think that there is this assumption, especially in a place like in the United States, where there's been relative stability for a long period of time, at least domestically, where the assumption is that the institutions are functioning and they are benevolent and they will only do what they're supposed to do. But this just isn't the case. This is not how systems like this work. As you increase the amount of power and the amount of authority, and that dependence on authority becomes more and more intense, then you start to see more and more abuse, and the abuse tends towards authoritarianism, and the system eventually tends toward really bad things. And I certainly think in the United States it's not hyperbole to say that we're very much in an ethnic cleansing right now. You look at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, you look at Customs and Border Patrol, and you see these very similar techniques in places that we consider dictatorships and authoritarian places. And it's this same tendency that we see, where we keep giving up more of these we keep giving things up, and they just take it, and it just keep and it's just. I always find it interesting that the government, the police state, if you will, the military, the intelligence community, and and police agencies in particular, they never ask for less. They always ask for more. You'll never hear a politician say, actually, we need less. We don't need this many police officers. We don't need this many, tanks and aircraft. This is not it doesn't tend in that direction. It just keeps getting big. The United States has the largest and most expensive, military in the world, almost $700 billion a year. 2 years ago, it was only $550 billion a year. We have the largest prison population in the world by far. We have we have some of the most intense police presence in our cities of any country at all. And they're armed to the teeth in many instances. And, it's one thing after another, but it's always more, and they're always going to be asking for more. And, and my position is that, rather than give them more, we should stop that and, strongly oppose that. And, you can't just reform it anymore. That's my that's my thing.
I want to come to how you challenge that in a minute, but I do want to ask again: at what point did you start to see the politics of this? What point did you start to see this as being a problem? Was it back in Iraq? Has it been since your release from prison? At what point did you start to understand the world in this kind of form?
My first introduction, but I wasn't really political, was being homeless for a while. But I would say that the passage of Proposition 8 in 2008, at the same time as Obama was elected.
Proposition 8. Proposition
8 was it was a referendum in the state of California that earlier that year there was, marriage equality had been, made legal through the court process here, and that was undone. But that was largely the way I viewed it. Was that 51 point something percent of Californian voters voted to effectively divorce at the time. 11,000 people, and that was a real shock for me as to my sense of the world. I had been living under this assumption that history is over and things are always going to, get better, and things are, it was just, it challenged that, and it really shattered my understanding of the world, and of institutions being benevolent, because here's a supposedly benevolent political process doing something so horrific.
But there are two things that arise from that. First of all, that happened before you went to Iraq, before you joined the military.
Yes.
So you went into the military already questioning the role of authority.
No, that happened while I was in my pre-deployment time. So that was I was doing domestic work at the time, mostly border stuff.
Okay. It then also raises the question about how you respond to that, because what's happened since Proposition 8 is the Supreme Court in the United States has overturned Proposition 8, and marriage equality gay marriage is possible in California. What's wrong with those systems? Doesn't that show that the system actually works?
Well, what does marriage equality do for queer kids on the street like I was? What does it do for, because we have we have an astronomical number of queer and trans kids on the streets, and it's actually rising. It's not falling. Since marriage equality, since we've had a supposed queer and trans victory, like trans people in the military or whatever, when these things happen, it's only affecting a small portion of people, and it's not really getting, the issues that affect most queer and trans people that I know are systemic. It's heavy policing. It's the assumption that if you're walking while trans, that you must be, soliciting for, sex work. None of these things can be simply addressed by one court ruling. And I wrote an article at the time on the day of that the marriage equality ruling had passed. I basically said this. I feared that we had put all of our political eggs into this basket and left a whole lot of our communities behind.
Let's talk about the surveillance state, and in particular, surveillance capitalism that you've spoken about. Yes, you're smiling there. This is Facebook. This is the Cambridge Analytica story, which scraped millions of the data from millions of Facebook users, and then used that data to target them with political ads to influence the outcome of the last election. You're very concerned about that. You're very concerned about the way that big data and algorithms are used. Can you explain what it is that worries you?
Well, I mean, this is business as usual. It's not, the scandal here is that, it wasn't really scandalous. The Cambridge Analytica actually had what they were doing as their business model, as their statement. Their mission statement was effectively doing what they claimed to do. What happened with, what's happening with Facebook and Twitter is that, they've collected a huge amount of information on people on these social media networks. And, whenever you're using a free whenever you're providing your information for free for a free social media or social networking system, it's not really for free. You're actually turning over something. You're turning over your personal information, which can then be subsequently sold and used. And that's the model of the system. It shouldn't be shocking at all that this is happening. It's not great. I'm not defending it one bit, but these are features, not bugs in the system.
The question is, what does it mean for our society, and is there a way of pushing back from that? Pushing back?
Yes, there is a way of pushing back, but it's not going to come through, legislation or court rulings or anything like that. I think that there's an expectation that, because it's not an awareness issue. People are aware of this issue. This isn't an education issue about we need to educate people on government surveillance or corporate surveillance or the abuse of large amounts of, personal information. I think it is, or the manipulation of people based on that information. I think that we're aware of these problems. I think most people are aware of these problems. It's learning how to do something about it. And there's no one size fits all solution to that. But I do think that people need to do something in response, and you can't just ask a broken system to fix itself.
It's interesting. Denver Nix, who wrote a book about your case, he said that that your leak was the beginning of the information age exploding upon itself. And he was talking about a new era in which leaks were a weapon, that data security is of paramount importance, and privacy feels illusory. Do you recognize that description?
I do recognize the description, but I tend not to read about myself.
But is it a reflection of what's happening?
I think I think it's a little hyperbolic, just a little bit hyperbolic to say that. But I would certainly agree that things are trending in that direction. We are in a new era, and this is probably the most fundamentally shocking advancement since the printing press.
As disruptive as the printing press?
Even more so. I don't think that we are anywhere near. I think that the controversies that we're having are just scratching the surface. I think that when we look back in 2030, we'll be like, well, those issues didn't seem that bad.
There's a titter running through the audience, Chelsea. You probably can't hear it. You told the New York Times, in one of the articles that I read, that you told the New York Times, let's protect sensitive sources, let's protect troop movements, let's protect nuclear information. In other words, you're not about complete transparency. But you did say, let's not hide missteps, let's not hide misguided politics, let's not hide history, let's not hide who we are and what we're doing.
Actually, I think that this is an interesting thing because New York Times heavily edited that. It was actually a very different article from the one that I wrote.
What would you have said? What did you want to say?
I wanted to say that personal information was valuable and should be protected, and that most things that happen, my sense of government, secrets and information that's collected is that it always slides towards being more secretive, and it starts off with, well, it's just for sources and methods, and it's just for this, and it's just for that, but it rapidly slides to where everything is a secret, And, I just look at what's happening here in the US, where huge amounts of domestic policy now, whether it's, whether it's the use of stingray technology or the use of, or the use of, informants in investigations by the DEA and by, other law enforcement, ICE in particular. These are now, every one of these like minor policing actions is now viewed through the lens of national security, and it just constantly keeps getting bigger. That list of things that you rattled off just gets longer and longer and longer.
But again, let me put to you what the critics are saying, and that is that we live in a time of extreme threat. The war on terror is an ongoing conflict, and in that war on terror, we need to take these kinds of measures to keep us safe.
Well, I mean, whenever I think about the war on terror, I usually view it from the perspective of everyone else, which is that we're largely being terrorized by our own states, and you just see it where now look at the security theater as you go throughout the airport. I can't tell what's going on there. I think I got some static.
No, that wasn't static. That was applause.
Oh, okay, I got it. But yeah, you look at the security theater in the airport, for instance, and you look at, having, people in soldier outfits, everywhere. This is not necessary, this is a vastly disproportionate response to to these supposed things. These are largely an excuse, I would say, for bolstering and reinforcing an already exploding, police, military, and intelligence apparatus. And it's very profitable. You make a lot of money off this stuff. And at one point in life, I wanted to make money off of it as a contractor. So.
Yeah, and I'll probably betray my own politics here, but I also think that what happened to us in Egypt was a part of that war on terror, where national security is being used as a way of silencing critics. Chelsea, you have made a run at politics. You wanted to, or you tried to go for pre-selection for a Senate seat earlier this year, but you lost. Is your political career over?
No, I'm more of a, reality is more of an activist. I'm more of an activist and not necessarily a politician. So I view most of the work that I do through that lens. While I did run for Senate, the goal, and actually, I had this long sit-down meeting with all of the staff that we had when we started, whenever it kind of broke and became a much bigger news story than we actually expected it to be. And we got together and we decided, okay, we have a lot of news attention, we have all these things, which direction do we go in? We're at a crossroads here. Do we do we try to get elected for and do all of the things the focus groups and trying to fit within this criteria of what a voter, what this particular type of voter might be interested in? Or do we want to stick to our principles and have an actual platform that we believe in? And we chose the latter.
And let me just run through some of the policies, some of the things that were on your platform. You said close prisons and free inmates.
Yes, start shutting them down.
Eliminate national borders. Restructure.
I didn't say eliminate them, but certainly dramatically decrease the amount of policing that happens at them, where you're building border walls and guard towers, and there's huge amounts of regulations that you encounter, and I get nervous when I'm crossing over borders, and I know a lot of people who don't have the history that I have that feel the same way.
You wanted to restructure the criminal justice system, provide universal health care.
Restructure is probably a tame word. for it.
Oh, okay. What would it be? What's the word you would use?
I mean, the time for reform was like 40 years ago. Like we can't reform anymore.
It's a big manifesto, and I guess that fits the title of today's session. Chelsea Manning wants to change the world.
Yeah, it's a bit hyperbolic. I wouldn't have said that. That was y'all.
Chelsea, I'm going to ask one more question before we go to audience questions, and that is, look, in a lot of ways, you've become a kind of ink blot test for people. The people on the left see you as something of a hero, almost as a secular martyr, I think, as someone put it, as someone who stands up for openness and transparency, for transgender rights, for prison reform, and so on. And on the right, you're seen as a traitor, as someone who betrayed your own country. I know the truth is always going to be far more complex than that. Where do you fit into that spectrum?
I mean, what I've encountered is not that at all. I think what's going on here is that, you have large numbers of people who don't have any say and don't have any power and they're sort of the lesser classes of people versus people in positions of authority and positions of power. You don't hear these things coming out of the average person on the street. And I walk the streets largely unmolested, and I just have to deal with people running up and asking me for selfies. It's not what I think people like the CIA director and the Secretary of State and the president want. So I think that it's a divergence between people in power and people not in power is where this lies, not necessarily left versus right.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's not static again, by the way.
Yeah, I figured that out.
Right, if we can have the house lights up, I think we'll come to audience questions. We have 4 microphones, and anyone that has a question, I'd ask you to move to one of the microphones. I'll give you a moment or two. And it looks as though we've got a couple of people up by microphone 4 up in the back corner there. If we can have microphone 4. And before you say, I would urge you, please, could everyone, I am going to be fairly strict about this. If you could please make sure that you ask a question. We only have limited time, and please make it as brief as you can. Thanks.
Chelsea, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to witness you here today. It's a real tonic for the soul. My question is, has there ever been a day that you've regretted leaking what you did in the way that you did it?
I get asked this question a lot, but the simple answer is that I don't relitigate every, I'm not going to go back and, try to, go through every single thing that could have happened, because everything happened the way it happened because, that was the information I had at the time, available to me. The resources and tools that were available to me, which were limited at the time, and if I had made any other decisions, would I really be me?
Thank you. Microphone 2.
Hey, Chelsea. You're looking very impressive on a 15 to 20 foot high video screen here, by the way, in the hall. Hope to see you in the person sometime. I just wanted to, yeah, looking very nice. I just wanted to ask you, very famously, you snuck out the information on a Lady Gaga CD, I think, and assuming Born This Way, the track is, that sentiment is very important to you. I'm just wondering, are those kind of musical icons, were they very important in you finding your true gender identity and maybe feeling a sense of injustice to persecuted people that maybe led to the decision you made in terms of wanting to release that information to protect people from being hurt in the future?
I mean, I think it's just a stroke of sheer luck that was what I was listening to at the time. It could have easily just been Taylor Swift or Kesha. It's not. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of depth to that. It just, an incident of the moment.
Right, if we can go back to microphone 4, sir.
Yes, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Chelsea, for an interesting talk. I am Simon Levett at Western Sydney University and a PhD candidate. You briefly, I believe, referred to the fact that journalists in conflict zones are singled out for special protection, am I right? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with journalists while in Iraq and Baghdad. Thank you.
They were non-existent. As soon as Obama got elected, largely embedded reporter numbers dropped in almost instantaneously. So at any one time, I think that the count that we had, according to the PAO brief, was between 3 and 4 embedded reporters in the entirety of Baghdad. So, and also there's the relationship of embedded reporters versus, other reporters, where embedded reporters get all these special protections, but they also are restricted information that they are able to access and the things that they're able to write, because they can arbitrarily have that removed. And they don't have, there's actually been court rulings where, in the United States, where embedded reporting is not considered a First Amendment protected activity. It can be arbitrarily removed for any. It doesn't necessarily have to, or it can be no reason at all. It can just be at the whim of a commander in the field.
Right, microphone 2.
Yeah, g'day, Chelsea. My name's Brendan. I'm definitely not a PhD candidate. I'm just a regular bloke.
Like me.
So thanks for hearing me. I want to circle. I was really interested about your comments about hotspots in Iraq becoming hotter spots, and almost that due to the activity of applying more surveillance and more military and heating up the place. And then you made some comments later on about America and the activities there being hotspots, and then militarising the police and those spots becoming hotter spots. And obviously America's got one of the largest incidences of mass shootings in the world, yet you've got one of the biggest armed police forces in the world. So, and then you've gone on further to say that we're well beyond the point of reform. What's the solution? How do we back out of this? I mean, obviously, turning this into a war ourselves is essentially playing them at their own game. What's the solution to driving that backwards?
We have to start doing things ourselves, and the way, it's quite simple. Every action that we do and every decision that we make is in a sense a political decision. Going vegan is a political decision, and also not doing something at all, is essentially a political decision. Apathy is a political decision, that you're actively ignoring, something, So you really have to be engaged. You have to be involved, and there's way more, which we can do. As we have a lot more political agency than just putting in a ballot into a box, or signing a petition, or going to a protest with signs and chanting and doing things like that. We have a lot more political agency than that, and every single situation with every single person is going to be different. Obviously, I was in a particular position that differs from somebody on the street, but we both have the ability to make a difference, and a political difference. We have to find that way in which we can do it. But you really have to be paying attention in order to do that. And this isn't just for individuals; it's for communities. I mean, communities can come together and make decisions. And one of the things that I found during my run here in the U.S. Was that communities know exactly what they need. They don't need somebody telling them, "Hey, here's the solutions that I propose for your community." Really, they already know what the issues are. They already know what the solutions are. I think that most of the solutions that we have to these problems can actually be solved by communities coming together and solving them themselves, and not expecting a massive government to fix, to try to maybe give them some paltry thing. I think that that's sort of an approach that I have, is more of a bottom-up approach than a top-up or top-down approach.
Thank you.
Up in the back, microphone 3, please.
My name's Alex, and I work for Amnesty International. When we do finally get you here, what are you most excited to see and do in Australia?
Ooh, good question. I don't know. I really want to go to the western part, and I don't know, see some beaches and stuff.
Chelsea's in California at the moment, by the way, not short of beaches.
Yeah, and it's summer here too.
Which is not what you want to do when you're here then. Microphone 2, sir.
Hello, Chelsea, mate. My name is Cameron Strauss, and I just want to say the fact that I get to speak to you right now, I consider a big, big honor. I just also want to just quickly mention that my former local member of parliament was actually David Coleman, who was the immigration minister. So I just want to let you know that I promise that I'm just going to be campaigning so hard to get him out of the next election. Support Chris Gambit, everyone. He's an absolute legend. Just saying.
Right, your question, sir.
But my actual question was, you're talking about what policy platform you were campaigning for with your campaign. So like universal healthcare, demilitarizing the police, abolishing ICE, that sort of stuff. Bernie Sanders also supports a lot of similar policies, and it's very likely he's going to run in the next Democratic primary. If he does, will you support him?
I tend not to make those kinds of decisions ahead of time. I certainly will. I certainly take the time to make an assessment as to who I vote for in any election. But I can't. I'm not gonna, before that even gets put out there, because people do change their positions, and I have no idea. Like we haven't even had our midterm elections here in the West, so I'm hesitant to jump so far ahead, and I've got to say that I think that the midterm elections in the U.S. are probably not going to turn out the way that the rest of the world thinks they are.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
I just get this. I get the sense that there's two countries. There's a very isolated, set of cities on the coasts that differ very significantly from the middle of the country, like the Midwest in particular, and the mountainous regions and the deep South. And, obviously, there's the notion of things being red versus blue, but it's actually much deeper than that, because the red versus blue is, often a 5% difference in the population. But in terms of how these different places view the world, I think what differs significantly. I think that certainly establishment people in power in media think that they are in control, and that that their opinions are widely respected and widely held. But if you go out of the cities, you don't find that. You find that most people are skeptical and completely and largely ignore, talking heads on TV, or believe the opposite. So I think that's what's going on, is where it's the way that the outside, and not necessarily rural areas, but the way that, like outside of Washington, D.C., outside of New York, outside of Los Angeles, outside of San Francisco, the way that that part of the country views itself and views its position.
Okay. Microphone 3.
Chelsea, I'm Elaine. I'm from actually China here as an international student. So you haven't got a visa visit here.
You got lucky.
Thank you. So you haven't a visa visited Australia, but in China, there's literally no news talking about you, and we literally now VPN is become more and more difficult to. We don't even have the chance to visit Twitter or Facebook. So could you provide us some advice on how to deal with this kind of situation and how to relieve such kind of stress and anxiety facing this as a kind of situation in our country, as a person who really cared about this kind of social issues, and to keep ourselves safe and to keep ourselves.
Right. On the technical front, there's the tool Tor. The Tor project spends a lot of time trying to get to develop, bridges, so that way certain countries that have more restrictive internet connections are able to transfer information like to and from those, and that's a constant sort of arms race process. Especially in China, but the tool is available, and it's a lot more robust of a tool than virtual private networks are. And on the more political front, it's going to largely depend not on the outside world, but on what happens within China. And I think that control of the flow of information by the central state does not necessarily mean that there aren't other communication channels. I think that obviously people have throughout history been, like working through whisper networks and having close relationships that, transcend like a little bit further out of their areas. Family members move and, information flows and things like that. So I'm going to say that I do believe that many of these things can be transcended just by human nature and not necessarily by technology.
Right. Microphone 2, sir.
Hi. My name's Peter. I'm from a group called Intelligent Democracy, and that's maybe something that's hard to believe, but it can be done in Australia. But that aside, I'll show you the model sometime, folks. That aside, would you encourage Peter Greste to become a politician? Because there's a bunch of us who think he'd be very good.
No, I think it's a terrible idea.
Yes, so do I. I'm with you, Chelsea. I'm sorry, but thank you very much.
Yeah, for that. I'm just saying personally, like it is not something you want to do. And I want to explain that a little bit. I had to stand, I went canvassing out in certain neighborhoods, and I had to knock on people's doors and introduce myself and basically open myself up to them. And people are very, very brave in their own home at their front door. And so they ask really tough questions, and they tell you these incredible and amazing stories, and heartbreaking stories, and like inspiring stories, and then they ask you a question, and often it's a very difficult question that that oftentimes I had never even thought of before, and And from what I understand, most professional politicians usually have like a pamphlet or some robotic answer, but I couldn't tell them. I couldn't, give people a bullshit answer. It was I just couldn't do it, and that was the hardest part of the whole thing. And it actually wore me down quite a bit. Was being asked these really tough questions and not having an answer, but also being unwilling to pretend like I did have an answer.
Chelsea, that seems like a fantastic place to wrap it up. We have...
Sorry.
We would all love more. The clock, the clock is against us. The clock, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would absolutely love to make this, to extend this. I'm going to get dragged off the stage if I continue any longer, as the clock ticks down to 6, 5, 4 seconds left. So thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all.
You probably can't see it, Chelsea, but we have a standing ovation.
Yeah, I can't see it.